City Museum? Big question.
I did not.
Oh my God, have you never?
Did.
I think you would love the City Museum. It's one of those places that is, when I first heard about it, the City Museum in St. Louis, and has anybody heard of it? You must, yeah, I mean, it's like one of these places you think it's like a city history museum, who the heck wants to go there? And it's like the most outlandish museum you've ever seen. It's like a kid's museum for grown-ups. But there are a lot of kids too. It's like climbing into planes and buses that are 80 feet in the air and shoots. It's an old shoe factory, and you can actually slide down the chutes that they used to throw the shoes down. And, you go like 10 floors or something. Anyway, it was fantastic. That's off topic, however. I want to welcome you. I'm Danny Aker, the director of NEMA, the New England Museum Association, and we with Brad Larson are teaming up to bring Museumhive to fruition here. One of the things that I had a chance to do in St. Louis at the AAM conference was they asked me to be on a panel talking about Museumhive. And that was kind of interesting. It was organized by INLS, sponsored by an INLS grant. And so one of the people that was, in fact, the moderator of that was the director of museum services for INLS. And so a few of us were talking about the power of networking, and this being a very innovative and different kind of a program that combines social energy, as Brad pointed out, with a little bit of thought leadership, and then just this idea of launching, this thought leadership into the next spectrum where you all are participating in that. So these have been a lot of fun, and we bring in a person of note from outside this particular room, in this case, Elizabeth Merritt. And so, anyway, I want to welcome you. I'm really glad that you're all here tonight. And Brad, I'll turn it over to you to introduce Elizabeth and what we're going to talk about tonight.
All right. Well, great. So as many of you know, Elizabeth is the founding director for the Center of the Future of Museums. And every year they put out a report that talks about what are the major trends out there that affect what's happening in museums. So Elizabeth will spend about 15 minutes going through those. And especially, we identified a couple of ones that really seem to be speaking to our needs these days. One is a focus on empathy. And there actually has been a lot of discussion in the museum world about empathy in exhibits, empathy in programs. People are often looking to museums for leadership on topics like this. And the other topic that, one of the topics Elizabeth identified was mass migration. So we have two major topics that we'd like to put together here, and Elizabeth will be giving us an intro to those topics, as well as some of the other trends. And then I know that you all have a ton of interest and experience yourself. So after about 15 minutes, we're going to open it up to comments, discussions, questions, and really see where can we take this? Where can we collaboratively take this for the field of museums? So we're all here experimenting together. I'm looking forward to seeing where we go. So Elizabeth,
Great.
I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm going to hit the mute button because we've had some feedback in the past, and I'll just let you roll with it.
Yeah. Okay. And meanwhile, I'll say hi, Cinnamon. I think I see.
Uh-oh, sorry. I think I hit the wrong button. I thought I hit the speaker mute button.
Okay, how's that? That's good? All right. I was saying hi, Cinnamon, because I think I see you in the audience. Okay, so this is weird because now I can't hear you say anything. So if I tell a joke, and you're laughing, do something with your hands so I can tell you're responding. Like now, give me some hands. Yay, people are actually doing it. Thank you. That makes me feel better because it's oddly muted at this end. So I'm actually speaking to you from San Antonio, Texas, even though I'm based in Washington, D.C., because I'm at the Museum in San Antonio, where they brought me out to help me think about what the Children's Museum can do to celebrate San Antonio's 300th birthday. And that's the sort of thing I'm trying to do with the Alliance for the Field, which is, on the occasion of a 300th anniversary, that's a good time to be thinking something like 300 years forward. And maybe most of us, when we're thinking in the future, it's more like 25 or 50-year chunks. But it's the kind of futures thinking that can be really inspiring. It's a chance to sit back, reassess our assumptions about the way the world's working and the difference we can make, and maybe make some course corrections as we think of ways we could do an even better job at making the world a good place to live. So as Brad was saying, one of the things I do to help with this kind of long-term thinking every year is to do a yearly trends report. And this is really the culmination of a lot of little work throughout the year. So do any of you subscribe to Dispatches from the Future of Museums? Any hands? Yay! So Dispatches is a free weekly e-newsletter where out of all of the obsessive reading I do every week, I'll pick like 12 stories and say, these are good stories. You know, you may not have time to spend hours scanning the news, but if you have a few minutes to do some light reading, here's 12 stories that give you signals of the way the world's changing, some interesting things that are happening, some important things affecting our community, whether it's policy issues or technological issues or financial issues. And I always include some cool examples of museums that are doing really neat things to respond to these trends. But after a year of writing these stories, I take time to sit back and look at the whole and say, well, what do I see emerging? What's bubbling up out of all of these hundreds of stories that I think have bigger import, large themes that museums should be paying attention to? And that's when I sit down and pick 5 or 6 trends to recruit other people around the world to help me think about, because every year I recruit 5 or a dozen smart partners to help me think about these things, and then come out with a report that says, why is this issue important for society? Why is it important for museums? What are some of the implications for museums and how we respond to these trends? And what are some really good examples of museums doing good work in these areas? So I'm going to now share my screen. So this might just take a minute to set up. Okay, and before I share all of the screen, can somebody just give me a thumbs up in the front row so I know that you are seeing my screen? Great. Because otherwise I've got no way of knowing it's not working. So what you're looking at now is the front cover of this year's Trends Report, TrendsWatch 2017. And this year, with the support of the American Alliance of Museums, where I'm running the Center for the Future of Museums, I picked these 5 trends bubbling up out of all of the stories I'd been following for the year. The first one, as Brad mentioned, is the growing empathy deficit and growing concern about how we start reversing that trend towards less empathy in the world. The second one is criminal justice reform, because it's becoming increasingly clear that criminal justice reform is really the next frontier of civil rights, that so many of the inequities that we're fighting in society are a result of structural inequities of how we make laws, how we enforce laws, how we sentence people when they transgress, the results of incarceration and practices that make it really hard to reintegrate people into society after they've been caught in the criminal justice system. Every year I write about a technology trend, and this year I wrote about artificial intelligence because it's really beginning to break out as something that affects people's daily lives. Some of you may have like Alexa that can actually listen to you talking and then do things in response, including ordering things from the web. Working at a children's museum today, I heard some funny stories about children who had figured out how to game their parents' AI assistants like Alexa to actually order things from Amazon without permission. But artificial intelligence, basically computer programs that can do things that we used to think only humans could do, like language and making decisions and making projections about what will happen and how to respond to that, are beginning to become mainstreamed into things like self-driving cars or chatbots that can mimic somebody talking to you. And that is going to have a tremendous effect on jobs in the next 40 years, displace a lot of labor, but maybe create some new opportunities as well. I had actually been working for several years to collect stories about museums responding to mass migration because it's such a big issue, and we'll be talking more about that in a minute. So I will just skip straight to the last section of the report, which I will not talk about today, but I encourage you to, which as I was writing the report, I used as a shorthand when I was talking to people. I'm writing about failure And they would give me a blank look and say, why are you writing about failure? And I had to learn about language I could use to say, no, really, this is a good thing. Failure is a necessary part of learning. And we have a really dysfunctional relationship with failure in our society. Failing, they get stigmatized for failing. It results in bad grades. And how can you be creative and how can you be curious if you're not willing to take a little leap and make a little fall and then get up and do it again? So this is something that both our educational system and museums need to learn from. So at Brad's suggestion, the two things I'm going to do a little deeper dive into today are empathy and mass migration. Empathy came to my attention because there's really a staggering amount of research showing that we are in the midst of, indeed, an empathy deficit. I'm showing you a graph from some research that was done at the university by somebody named Dr. Conrath, who analysis, he rounded up 72 empathy studies that had been done of over 14,000 American college students since 1979, and he found that all of that research cumulatively documented a 48% decline in empathy over the past 4 decades. Particularly emotional empathy, the ability to be emotionally concerned about people. But this is part of a larger body of research that has been documenting this generally and in a number of specific fields. I'm concerned about this. People are worried that it's been tied to our overall decline in social trust, a rise in discrimination, in bullying, and in hate crimes. And this is just at a time when, as we're about to talk about, there's an increase in mass migration that leaves a lot of displaced people vulnerable to things like xenophobia and discrimination. So I'm encouraged to learn that the consensus is that there are things you can do to build empathy. It's like a muscle. If you sprain it, you can do exercises to make it stronger again. So a lot of people have been everything from how virtual reality can actually concern to how engaging with art can help people put themselves in another person's shoes. As a matter of fact, this year we saw the founding of the first empathy museum devoted entirely to the subject. It opened as a pop-up exhibit in London in the past year. It was founded by the philosopher Roman Krznaric and the artist Claire Patty, who's its founding director. Great exhibit that looks like a giant shoebox. You can't see that in this shot. I encourage you to go online and look for more photos, where when you visit, you can check out a pair of shoes and an audio recording, and as you walk, you hear the story of the person who owned those shoes. And it might be someone who is homeless, or someone who is transgender, or somebody who is experiencing other discrimination in society, to really help you a bit more what it's like to be in their situation. And I also found a lot of individual museums, some of which I talked about in the report, that are doing specific projects, like hosting the Human Library, which is a great project where have a collection of people who act as human books. So I can go to the Human Library project, which may be hosted at a local museum, and say, I would like to check out someone who is a survivor of the Holocaust, and speak to this person who can firsthand tell me what it was like living in Nazi Germany and share their experiences, or check out someone who is a policeman and say he could talk to me about what it's like being feels that some people are afraid of him. What's it like to try and be enforcing laws in a community that may have a lot of tension. Projects that are cultivating empathy. And one of the big takeaway questions I have for museums is, why don't you think a little bit about it should be one of your intentional outcomes, and whether you should be trying to measure whether you are moving the needle on visitors. So can you establish it just as validly as we want to know people came and learned this fact, or we wanted to have people improve this skill? Can we say we want people to go away from one visit or multiple visits empathic concern for each other as people? I think that's a very important outcome, and I think there's good evidence, some of which I've summarized in the report, that museums can in fact set that as a goal and turn around and say to society, this is one of the important roles we can play in making the world a better place. Now, as I mentioned, one of the reasons empathy is more important than ever is the fact that we are in a time of unprecedented, well, practically unprecedented forced migration. This is the largest displacement of peoples globally since World War II. And right now, there is about 65 million people who are displaced by war, by conflict, or by economic pressure, or by climate change. Very interested to look into the climate, so-called climate refugees, because there is an estimate that by 2050, there will be about 50 to 200 million people globally who have been forced to relocate by things like rising tides, increased storm surge, or high temperatures, including here in the US. You know, refugees aren't people who flee other countries. In the US, there are large areas of the country that are being threatened by global warming. And here's a map showing Ile de Jean Charles in not far from New Orleans in Louisiana. 90% of the land mass has been lost since 1955. And so the population, which are mostly descendants of a couple of Native American tribes, are being relocated at the cost of a number of $1 million by the federal government because their community is essentially underwater and they've lost their homes. So refugees aren't just people coming to the U.S. from other places. We have our own displaced.
Sorry, Elizabeth. Brad popping in here. We're losing the audio a little bit. Maybe if we take a little break here and I pop my face onto the screen like this and say a few things, maybe we could give it another run. And let's hear the audio.
Okay, let's just do an audio check. Can you tell what's changing? Because I haven't moved the microphone here. How's that sounding?
It's better. It's breaking up a little bit. It's better, but breaking up a little bit.
If it's breaking up, it's probably the Hangout connection.
Yeah, that is probably a bandwidth thing, and hopefully as time goes on, it'll kind of fix itself. But sorry for the interruption. Why don't we just continue, and I'll flag, or we can wave our hands or something if we're having difficulty hearing. So if we're having difficulty hearing, we'll kind of wave our hands, and then maybe we could repeat or pause or let the bandwidth kind of do its thing for a minute. All right.
When I'm sharing my screen, the downside is I can't see you. So what you could do you have access to the chat messaging function on the side of the screen?
Yes.
No, I can't see that either on my screen. Okay, I will leave that on so I can see you message me. And the good news is I only have a couple more slides, and then I'm going to take this down and we'll just be talking. So then it'll be very clear when you can say if I need to repeat something, okay?
Sure, okay.
So let's just try and finish up this part quickly. And I'll have this only be a partial screen so that I can see you if you're trying to signal me. All right, we lost our place there. Catch up. All right, so there are a number of museums doing excellent work helping their host communities get to know their new neighbors who have been displaced from other countries, and helping people who have been displaced feel welcome. I call out a number of excellent examples in the report, including places like the Swiss National Museum that have done a good job of using empathy as a point of connection, helping people understand the stories of new immigrants and refugees in their own voices, to be able to think about what it's like to have to leave home and have to choose the few items you can take with you, or what it's like to find yourself in a new country where you don't speak the language and don't know how to navigate. So I think there are a lot of roles museums can play that have been well documented by their peers, but all of that starts with an awareness of knowing who are the migrant and refugee communities around your museum, who has moved into the community. What are their needs? What are the things you might do to make them feel more comfortable, even if those things are outside the normal scope of your mission and activities? Something as simple as inviting them in to share tea and cookies, or get to know the staff, or get to know other visitors. And also to show that you appreciate what they're bringing to your community as a strength and as a resource. They may know things about your collections that you don't know, if those collections originated from their cultures. They may be experts in their own fields and welcome the chance to exercise that expertise with the museum when they're able to do so as paid or unpaid employees. So giving them a sense of dignity in their new community and helping share the museum's imprimatur and authority by saying these are valued people that we want to welcome into our circle of friends. Okay, I wanted to remind people where they can find more information about this before we segue to the discussion. There's now a website that's part of the Alliance's new labs portion of our website, where I'm feeding updated information on these trends. I tag stories when I read them in the news, and they push to here as new posts go up on the CFM blog related to these topics. They go up. And I also encourage you to subscribe to dispatches, to read these stories as they come up on the CFM blog, and you can find our content all over social media where we're Future of Museums, and that's Twitter and Facebook and Pinterest and YouTube. And I wanted to make sure to thank the organizations that underwrite TrendsWatch, which allows me to distribute all this content for free, this in the support of the AAM membership. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and go back to looking at your wonderful faces. And let's get some dialogue going here. I hope that you guys have comments, observations, stories you can tell me about how these things are playing out in your communities. I'm happy to take questions. I may or may not know the answers, but let's get an interesting talk going in any case.
Sorry, I think we were muted, Zach. So I think, can you hear us now, Elizabeth?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay.
My question is, I was very interested to hear about the walk a mile in my shoes, but what if somebody's in a wheelchair and wants to do that activity?
That's a good question. I will have to write to Claire and ask her how they're accommodating people with disabilities. The other thing is, I would like to go back to their website, because they actually have a site where they put pictures of the shoes and copies of the audio recordings, so you can get a feeling for the activity, even if you can't visit the pop-up. I mean, my first two thoughts are, one, I wonder if they have a wheelchair among their shoes, because metaphorically it's similar. And I also wonder if they find that people in wheelchairs also check out the shoes and do the activity even if they're not walking in them. So I will pass that question on to Claire. And if she publishes the answer somewhere, I'll put a link to it on social media. Maybe she can do it as a comment on the blog post she wrote for me.
Elizabeth, we had a theory that we wanted to try out. If you unplug your headset or wrestle the cable around, we're wondering if that might help.
Okay, try that. Is that it?
I think it actually is. So the suggestion is maybe the headset would be the thing, but maybe play with the wire. It actually, I kind of think it may be a bandwidth thing, and I'm not sure how to best deal with it. Hopefully, it'll kind of, are people able to hear and understand what's going on? I think that's a key thing. All right.
Well, the other thing I can do if we're having really bad sound, technological workarounds. As long as I understand the question, I can also be typing the answer, or at least an abbreviated version of the answer in the chat message, which might help if the audio is getting wonky. Though you'll have to bear with me because I'll be multitasking. So it might be a little slower, or my typing may radically misspell everything, and you'll just have to forgive me.
I think we're actually okay. We just have to, we're a little bit on the edge of our seats. And kind of like, oh, I think I understand that, but I think rather than decreasing your bandwidth, along with the bandwidth of the connection, I think it's good enough. And,
okay.
You know what it's like, Brad? It's like the NATO conference. Now, it's just a little, we need a little transition. Sierra, you have one?
I should have just sent a telepresence robot.
So I guess my question is surrounding empathy and like how that's measured, or how you came to the conclusion that empathy was something that there isn't. I have heard that there's no deficit, and that's definitely a conversation that's happening. But from my perspective, I think that we're like, I know that we're in the least time in human history, and also I feel like we're in the most empathetic time, and people will say, oh, you're a snowflake, you're PC, or whatever. But I feel like we are in the most empathetic time, so I'm wondering how you reach that conclusion that empathy was what you want to focus on for this framework.
Okay, you were breaking up a lot on that one, so let me try repeating the question and let me know if I heard it correctly. So from what I could hear, you were saying that your feeling is we're actually in a time when people are increasingly empathic and expressing a lot of concern for each other, and therefore you're asking how I identified there as being an empathy deficit. Did I hear you correctly? Yeah. So I'm just going from what I read. I've seen a lot of scientific studies that people have been raising as being of concern to their fields of study, whether they're psychologists or child behavior or developmental specialists. And I'm going to tie this, though, you made a very good observation, to something that I spotted in the last chapter, which is about failure. One of the fundamental flaws of our system of scientific research publishing is there's a bias against publishing negative results, okay? So it's like the press. You write stories about what's interesting. So if you look for something and you don't find it, you often don't publish a paper saying, hey, I didn't find anything. So it's more of a story and more of a publishable research finding that there is an empathy deficit than that you're not seeing any decline in empathy. So I totally validate your observation that what we could be seeing is a biased sample of research, because it's more interesting to publish results about seeing a decline than publish a result that says there's no change. Or I think it would still be interesting if you saw an increase, so maybe I wouldn't presume a bias against that. But yeah, it's pointing to a limitation in our system for looking for information. Is it a better story? Do people pay attention to it because they're scared by the prospect of an empathy deficit? So all I can say is I have found plausible research that validates the observation. And I think it's worth considering, just because some of the things that people worry are linked to a deficiency of empathy clearly are on the rise. Things like bullying, where there is a documented increase in bullying, or concern about a rise in hate crimes or discrimination. So I don't know. It may be specific to which populations you're looking at or certain behaviors. It's worth being aware that it may be a matter of finding what you look for, and that people are, because they're worried about it, that's what they're finding when they look at the research, and that's what they write about, because it makes a good story.
Who's next? Elizabeth, Dan here. So I have a follow-up, sort of. And you know, what's interesting to me is that the whole subject of empathy lacks metrics. And that's part of what we are maybe struggling with, is that, well, you know, it's anecdotal, perception that we're in a deficit, empathy deficit. What they used to call it, the missile gap or an empathy gap or something. We don't have a way to really fully measure empathy. And in a similar way, museums don't have a way to measure, you know, how they can produce empathy. Is that true or not true? I know there's been research done on how to do it, but I'm not sure it's accepted.
Well, that's a good point, because, well, there are two primary ways that I've observed that people are doing the metrics of, are you exhibiting empathy? And one is attitudinal and one is behavioral. So you can ask people to agree or disagree with certain statements, okay? And there you have to be aware that they may be saying what they think they ought to say, right? So if anything, you might get a bias towards people wanting to look good. You know, so do you feel like this other person is X or Y, or do you think that if you passed somebody who was, you know, had this need, you'd stop to help? Then the other studies are actually creating these fake situations where you observe if somebody stops to help a stranger or expresses concern. The only kinds of studies I've seen museums try and do so far are the first ones, asking people what they feel or what they think and observing the language they use. So, for example, I should go back and look at this again, but I believe that when Crystal Bridges did their study a couple of years ago now, right, trying to measure whether there was anything that they could document as the effect of a field trip to the museum. And one of the things that they reported was a measurable increase in historical empathy, of being able to say, I think the person in the painting feels, or I think the person in the painting had this experience. So they were looking at how kids talked about what they saw and whether they were putting themselves in the shoes of the people they were seeing in the art or of the artist. I don't know of any museums that have tried to do behavioral empathy studies, and I might feel a little uncomfortable trying to set up that kind of experience, that kind of experiment in a museum. You know, were people more likely to stop and help somebody or express concern for somebody who clearly hurt themselves just after they exited the gallery as opposed to when they were going into the gallery, when you set somebody up to pretend to be in distress or have an accident? There might be consent issues and research ethics issues about that. But I think this actually gets at a point that I think we have to worry about as museums for other reasons. I think that a lot of the effects that I hope and believe museums have on people are small cumulative changes that are hard to detect. And the only way that we're going to find these sort of deeper, complex, profound effects is if we have the kind of long-term, large-scale, longitudinal data that can tease out those subtle effects. So we need the cultural equivalent of the Framingham study on health, right? So if you recruit thousands of people and track them for 40 years, you can start to say, oh, you know, it never occurred to us that this behavior had an effect on heart disease, or this diet had an effect on cancer. And if we really had a way to track the people who in society and what they do with their free time, you know, are they cultural consumers who go to museums and symphonies and performing arts? Are they people who watch television and have other choices about spending their free time? Could you cumulatively say people who visit museums are happier or healthier or express more well-being or behave in a way that is more empathetic? I think we would find good things, but it's going to take that kind of really large-scale data with an overarching data collection method, not just putting it on one museum to say, why don't you figure out if people have more empathy when they come out of your one exhibit?
One fruitful area of collaboration might be with Carol Riff from the University of Wisconsin. I attended her session in St. Louis. She's been doing this. It's called the Midas study, that basically has created some kind of a quantitative measurement of well-being, and as it's applied to museums. And I thought it was fascinating, and you know, it's got a lot of applications, because as we're trying to articulate what museums do best, not economic development or, you know, what have you, that we're kind of pigeonholed into doing for advocacy purposes. We change people. Make people feel better, all of these kinds of things. And it might be that, you know, empathy component is part of something that we can tease out her research. That's Carol from the University of Wisconsin. She's awesome.
I'm really looking forward to listening to the recording of her session. It's one of the ones I had flagged as what I would go to as the session if I weren't actually working the meeting. So yeah, I'll look forward to that. The other thing is there are a few other semi-large scale studies that are being done. In Britain, in the UK, they're doing the Happy Museum Project, which is trying to document in a quantitative way effects on community well-being of museum engagement. So I think there are other areas we can look to borrow their methodology or build on their results.
Yeah.
Cool. Can you talk a little bit more about the idea behind the failure and like why that's important to you?
Yeah, okay, so I'll tell you the story. Here's why I started really thinking about it, about writing about it for TrendsWatch. I've been hearing about design thinking and user-centered design for a number of years, and that was fine, it was working. But it didn't really resonate with me until I read a story in the paper about the San Francisco Opera. And the reason it caught my attention was a couple of years ago, I had the chance to work with Opera America to go speak to their members. And it was the only conference I've ever been to where the attendees said of museums, oh, you guys have it so much better than we do. Because the operas actually see themselves as being worse off in terms of losing audience and becoming obsolete and having to prove their relevance. And it was unusual to be in a whole conference full of people who were envious of museums as being cool and relevant. That's sad, isn't it? Okay, so here's the story. The San Francisco Opera. So opera, part of this is operas are actually one of the few industries that are more perfectionist than like art museums. So museums generally pretty high standards, want to really produce good work, and within museums, especially art museums, everything has to be perfect. Opera, if we're here in our obsessive compulsiveness about perfection, operas are up here. And so they were starting a smaller performance space, and they realized they didn't want to just do exactly all the same things except little. They wanted to really cultivate a new audience. They couldn't just do that by having the same stuff go in a different space. So they worked with Stanford's D School to get a couple of the students to come and do their final project with the opera, and to do it about prototyping and trying to do user-centered design. And they tried a number of ways to get the opera staff to loosen up and try new things. And what they ended up doing was giving them this assignment. I think they had like 3 weeks. They said, design something new and go prototype it. Just boom, go. You've got 3 weeks to do it, and like very little budget. And what they did was they said, okay, the one thing that's pretty much going to be the same as the music. Everything else can be different. So they found a performance space that they rented, and they put out the advertisements by social media. It's just like, we're going to come do this fun thing called Barely Opera. Come spend the night. It'll be fun. There'll be drinks. There'll be liquor. Yay, opera and liquor. What could be better? So if you showed up, there were people lined up around the block to get in. It totally filled up. You got in the front door, and the first thing you were offered is, do you want to wear a costume? Look, we have costumes from the opera, and you can wear one at this event. This is great. So they raided their costume stock, and people could put on, horned hats and robes and crowns. The opera singers and the staff, though, were all dressed up in like jeans and T-shirts. And up on stage, they had a Wheel of Fortune type wheel where you could come and spin it, and it would go around and round and round, and then whatever song it stopped on, the performers would perform. Or I think they took requests too. And when the performers got up, they were very laid back, very casual and informal until they began to sing. The music was very serious, though they played around with it a bit. There was this wonderful video, you can find clips of it online. There was this wonderful duet between a man and a woman, performers who were actually married to each other. And they were really playing off each other with little digs about being man and wife. And then at the end of the duet, they kissed and everybody applauded. So the thing was, they got a much younger and more diverse audience than they would have gotten at a formal performance. And it wasn't just the cost break. One of the things I noticed was one of the deep fears of opera is that the core content is losing its appeal. But the fact that this is very formal music in a foreign language and most people don't know what you're singing is one of the things turning people off. And that's a problem because that's your core product. One of the things they did in this experiment is they had some pop music thrown in. So on the wheel, or if people requested it, they would do popular songs. And people didn't like that part. They didn't choose that part. They didn't come to hear opera. So the good news coming out of this was that the core content, the music and the high quality of the performance, was totally what people loved. It was everything else that they changed that made it more accessible. It was alleviating people's fears that they wouldn't be dressed right, or that they couldn't wander in and out if they were bored, or being able to get a drink, or knowing it was okay to laugh and goof around. So it was the culture and the atmosphere around it. And I read that story and I thought, wow, I really wish that more museums had this kind of playful attitude towards trying out what they do to help them figure out what is the core thing that still has value, that they really care about, that resonates with people, and what are all the trappings that we've added to it that we may feel very good about, but maybe turning off a lot of the people who don't come and don't love us. So I think part of that is this process of being willing to fail and fall flat on our faces and do more little projects that may or may not work, to experiment, to help us find what that core value is, which as a field I find we have trouble articulating. In some ways, Operate has an advantage. They know exactly what their core product is. And also help us start finding out where there are alternate ways of doing things, where it doesn't kill us to change it, and in fact, it may make us more accessible and more popular. That's why I think it really matters for museums. As a society, I think we have a really unhealthy attitude towards failure. And one of the most resonant things I was reading when I was thinking about whether to write about this was a story that said, you know what? People wail on video games. They say, oh, it's terrible, the kids have all the screen time and they're playing all these games for hours. And this psychologist was writing, he said, you know, one of the things games do really well, they teach kids about productive failure. Because anytime you play a video game, what happens? You die. You die over and over again. And you say, hey, I'm going to be resurrected and try again, and this time I'm going to level up. So as opposed to like the formal school system where failure means getting an F and getting in trouble, games and video games, digital games, are really good at teaching kids how to have a positive attitude towards failure and trying again. So those were sort of the two stories that really sparked me to write about it, because I think we have a lot to learn from them.
Okay, who's next? Tegan. Pass this mic there.
Hi. One of the things that I was struck by in reading the TrendsWatch report was these really great projects that museums are doing. And my internal reaction was, oh man, I wish we could do that. If my museum were bigger, more resourced, we could do that. Or if we operated like a startup, which isn't really my speed, but is many people's, you know, they're small institutions, but they're founded with this cool premise or something like that. What do you recommend for museums that feel like these grand projects to get people involved, you know, talking with migrants or migrants talking with locals or more established locals, I guess, or empathy? How do you scale that down when there's such ambitious concepts?
You know, this is one of, I'm going to take advantage of this being a dialogue because I would like to learn from you guys. Before I try and answer that, I want to know if there's anybody else in the audience who wants to leap up and say, small museums rock when it comes to this, and here's one of the ways to approach it. So anybody in the audience from a small museum want to take a crack at that?
Yeah. I don't work at a museum, but I think that reaching out to communities and specifically community organizations, and even if you can like really like relationship building on a very micro level, even if it just means going to a high school and figuring out like who has the most friends, or you know, just making connections on like that small level. I work at a gallery, and like one of the best things I've been able to do is have tea parties. And like were, you know, my favorite thing, because it really allowed me to have a relationship with the youth, first generation immigrant youth that are in my neighborhood. That I believe like in the space a lot more than, you know, the adults could. And that's just my personal opinion. Yeah, like reaching out, relationship building on that level. That's really important.
That's a great answer. I agree 100%. Usually the things I see people having real barriers to doing in smaller museums are some of the technology things that are cutting edge enough to be expensive. It's not the human relationship stuff. And most of the things, frankly, that you can do with technology, you can find an analog low-tech way of accomplishing the same thing, because it's really about what you're helping people do and understand and communicate with each other, not so much the technology itself. And I think migration is a good example of it being about relationships.
Brad.
Yeah. So I had a thought, starting to do our Museumhive thing and build our hive, to start to weave between our different presenters. So I'm thinking, Antonio is the other one who's been to all four of the segments. On the spot. But as we listen to these things, there are some themes that are coming up again and again. And one of the themes is relevance. Like, how do we be relevant to our communities? So Nina, Simon, and Kimberly Drew, I think we're both hitting the topic of relevance and being relevant to the community. And the other theme that we heard last time from Becky Anopoulos was go beyond neutrality, take a stand. And I wonder what you see happening, Elizabeth, with those two themes, the themes of being relevant and also taking a stand. Because it's probably difficult for a lot of museums to say, we're going to take a stand on this issue. Here's what we believe. And what's your perspective? Do you see that happening out there? Or what are some of the first steps that you see museums taking to start to take more of a stand?
So did you want me to tackle the first part of it, the relevance first, or is it a two-part question, or is it all pivoting towards
Yeah,
the?
I think whatever you feel is kind of in the mix. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to admit, to somebody who grew up being kind of allergic to the word relevant because it was being used way too much when I was a teenager, and overexposure gave me a bad reaction. So when I started working with museums, I almost had to reshape it in my own language. And what really clicked for me was when I started having people trying to start museums come to me and say, how do we make this work? How do you build a financial structure to start a new museum and have it work? And the way I restructured it in my head was, I said, I don't mean this in a rude way, but the question you have to ask yourself is, who cares? Who cares? Because if you can answer that question, that in the end is going to answer the question of where the money comes from. And if you can't answer that question, you have a big problem and maybe you shouldn't have a museum. And then I realized, that really is just a different way of saying, are you relevant? Who cares? What difference do you make in the world? If you went, and for established museums, if you went away today, how would the world miss you? Why would it be a poorer place without you? What's the hole you leave when you went away? And I think the tie from there to being an activist is museums that choose to take a position on wanting to change the world in a specific way have clearly articulated how they want the world to be a better place. The Empathy Museum is saying, we believe the world is better with more empathy, and we believe we can influence that. Something like the New Migration Museum in London is saying, this is a tremendous issue that's reshaping the UK, and we think helping people understand it will help them make better choices about policies and about how they behave with each other as human beings. The Eastern State Penitentiary, when they chose to create an exhibit that was not just about the history of incarceration, but about the effects that mass incarceration has on our society and how it makes our society poorer and impairs our ability to function as a culture. They took a stand, they went beyond neutrality, and they said, here's how we are going to try and help make the US a better place by helping people reassess the effects of our policies of mass incarceration. So I think the link for me is, if you can show how you're trying to make the world a better place, you also have asked the question of who cares. Because people who share that vision of a better world will be your supporters. Now, where it gets tricky, of course, is when there's disagreement, either about the underlying issue, and I'm sure that Becca has to deal with people who do not believe in climate change or the ability of humans to influence climate change, or when there's fundamental disagreement about the solution. So I empathize deeply with museums where there may be a split in the community or a split in the board or a split among funders where they say, well, yeah, but you represent us too. We're your supporters. And you need to respect our opinions and views when you decide which positions to take. So I hear museums at both ends of that process or along that spectrum and making the decision of when to take a stand and when to be activist museums. Many are inspired by the ability to say we're going to make a change in the world, and many feel that they are bounded in part by respecting the opinions and the beliefs of the people who are their actual supporters, who are paying to keep them open.
Hey, who's up with that? I'm going to follow up with that, Elizabeth, because this is fascinating to me. The idea that you put out. We haven't talked about the migrant issue that much tonight. I thought that was really compelling in TrendsWatch. You have, and many make this, it's a moral issue, this is a moral issue. We should be empathetic to folks that are fleeing refugees. Fundamentally, though, right now, it's more of a political issue than it is a moral issue, at least in the United States. And some museums are totally gun shy of that, in the sense that you know, you hear about the dialogue about sanctuary cities, that, you know, being, losing their funding, and museums might be quaking in their boots, thinking, gee, if I take a stand and start, you know, reaching out to migrant communities, I might be in danger of something. How do you address those museums who kind of want to do the right thing, but feel the weight of politics on them right now?
Is anybody in the audience somebody who's actually dealing with this question in their own community and their own internal or local politics?
Yes,
Who's willing to talk about it? Or you're just not willing to talk about it? Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because I have had conversations.
Well, all right, so, no, wait, sorry, Elizabeth, Heather reminded me of my staff. Last week, we had a panel at the Davis Museum about their exhibition / event called Artless, in which they took a stand against the travel ban by shrouding or removing artwork at the Davis Museum at Wellesley College, any artwork that was produced or donated by immigrants of any kind. I don't recall that they had any particular blowback politically, but I know that we're talking with the director and the curators that it was a fraud issue for them to just decide whether to do that.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So they were anxious about it, though when they actually did it, they didn't get any response. So part of that was them imagining what might happen.
Yeah, everything seemed to be positive, but we're living in, you know, the People's Republic of New England here, so.
Yeah, so you in Berkeley, you should just be sort of sister areas of the country. But if you read the commentary nationally, I do know that there has been a strain of commentary with some people saying, why would art museums do this? That's not what art is about. But that's exactly where the dialogue begins, because that is what art is about. Art is a way of helping us understand our values and understand society and see different interpretations of the world and explore what that means. So I think just starting the dialogue about whether art museums should be politically active is a valuable conversation, because art isn't just something pretty you hang on the wall that makes you feel good. It's a lens of seeing the world. And I was a little bit stymied because the very first thing you said when we started that question was, I framed it as a moral issue, but it was playing out politically. Those are the same thing. Politics are about our shared ethics and our shared values. So the reason it's contentious is because we're having this debate in the society about what is ethical and what is moral. And there's nothing more important to figure out than how to have that debate in a way that's productive and comes to a resolution that we can live with. I think, to me, that's the hard part. It isn't just tackling it, it's tackling it in a way that begins a productive dialogue that may, in fact, change people's hearts and minds. Because it's very easy to just yell at someone you disagree with and then feel good about it because you took a right stand. The really difficult thing is doing it in a way that makes people able to approach the topic with an open mind and go away perhaps having changed their thinking.
Can you have empathy for a person while also challenging their fundamental value system?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you make a good point.
Well, or if not challenging their fundamental value system, making them see this issue in a productive way within the lens of their value systems. I've actually been reading a lot in the last few months. I can't imagine why, about what are any productive ways to have conversations with people who really radically disagree with you. And I found two papers that took a very interesting approach. They said, you know, you really can't argue with people about values because you simply disagree. And you can't, by arguing with them, you can't make them change their value structure. What you can do is show that you understand their value structure and recast your argument in the framework of accepting the fact that they believe that. So, for example, they were saying that, for example, if you understood that somebody believed in strong families, you might say, we believe that you should support young women who drop out of school as new mothers because in the end they have stronger families and are better parents if you support them in this way. So you're not trying to argue with them that it's wrong to believe in strong families. You're saying, okay, let's agree that that's a good thing, but talk about seeing in a different way this particular action that you're angry about. And if any of you come up with any good articles about how to have productive arguments like that actually lead somewhere, please send me a link because I need to see more of them.
All right, folks, we're one more question away to the finish line here. Sierra, you're dying to close it out. All right.
Can you talk a little bit more about like the importance of like speculative, like, you know, like what you're doing, like speculation and like futurism?
Okay, I couldn't, that one cut out. I couldn't hear that.
She wants you to explain what do you foretell in the future? And you've often,
Oh,
you often,
The process of futurism.
oh, the process of futurism.
oh,
Why?
this is where I get,
It's a great
so about the
question here. It'll take the next half hour to answer it. I've heard this answer before.
I can do the short version. So the good news is I'm off the hook because it isn't a futurist job to foretell the future. And as a matter of fact, if somebody tells you that they have a prediction about the future, unless it's about something very concrete, like, you know, I don't know, stock prices, but even that, you shouldn't believe them. It's a futurist job to help people imagine different futures and to realize how different the world could be, and that you have to be prepared for it turning out this way or turning out that way, and understand the forces that might take you in this or that direction. But the most important thing about future studies is to help people imagine the future they want to live in, and then figure out what they can do today, the specific actions they can take, which may include designing an exhibit or a program or talking to people in a certain way or reaching out to different audiences that would help incrementally make it more likely that you're going to end up in that preferred future than the other places we might get to accidentally.
After we're off the air, Elizabeth, I'll explain the cone of plausibility.
Yes, the cone of plausibility. Thank you.
Well, I think our time is up. And Elizabeth, I guess on behalf of Museumhive and NEMA and all the museum professionals here in New England and elsewhere that are going to be tuning in, I want to thank you for being with us tonight, sharing your wisdom, your expertise, your thoughts about the future. This has been absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure we'll be, no pun intended, buzzing about it for weeks to come. Thanks,
I
Elizabeth.
was waiting for you to make a bee joke. If you didn't do it, I would have done it.
Thanks, everybody, for showing up. We'll see you soon. Next museum. Thank you, Elizabeth. All right. Raz.
I'm gonna stop broad, oh, where'd that mouse go?
Whoa!